Thank you very much. I would like to thank the European office and the Greek office of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and SYRIZA for the opportunity to participate in this conference. Coming from Latin America, it is important to highlight the importance of dialogues and sharing of experiences, two central issues that have defined Latin American politics and struggles over the last 2 decades. Neoliberal economic adjustment and austerity policies on one hand, extractivism or natural resource-based economic policies are now central challenges for Greek social movements and the Greek left. I think it's best if I start by making my proposal, my perspective, as clear as possible. First, I think we're facing a deep crisis of civilization. Civilization based on unlimited growth and a constant attack on nature and the conditions that make life possible. We humans are using the planet's carrying capacity way beyond its reproductive capacity. Second, in spite of this massive overuse of the planet's carrying capacity, hundreds of millions of people do not have access to enough food, clean water, or shelter. Wealth and income and access to the commons of the planet are more unequally distributed than ever before in history. 3, unless drastic changes take place in the next 2 or 3 decades in production and consumption patterns, especially in the energy sector, and access to the commons is radically redistributed, life as we know it, not only human life, will not likely survive. 4, the 5th report on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change once again confirms that human activity is responsible for climate change, and the underlying causes for climate change continue to operate unabated. Global temperature continues to rise. And 5, the total failure of climate negotiations serves to highlight the extent to which we live in a post-democratic world. The interests of financial capital and the oil industry are much more important than the democratic will of the people around the world. In the global neoliberal society, profit is more important than life. Now about extractivism in Latin America. Historically, since the beginning of colonial times, more than 5 centuries ago, what is now known as Latin America played a crucial role in the international division of labor and nature. That of provider of primary goods or commodities based on slavery and other forms of exploitation. This immense transference of wealth to Europe via the European peninsula marked the beginning of the capitalist world system and provided the primitive accumulation of capital that led to the Industrial Revolution. Nothing much changed in this pattern of division of labor and nature with political independence. It was only in the Second World War, after the Second World War, that this position in the international, slower?
Translation.
Please stop me again if I start moving fast.
I'll patch you.
Okay. It was only after the Second World War that this position in the international division of labor and nature began to be questioned, realizing the constant deterioration of the terms of trade between the values of commodities that were exported and the industrial goods that were imported. The Economic Commission for Latin America, CEPAL, under the leadership of Raúl Prebisch, pushed for industrialization in the continent with import substitution. Facing many obstacles, these industrialization attempts were relatively successful, especially in the larger countries, in Brazil, in Mexico, and Argentina. But this began to change again in the 1970s. With military dictatorships, the debt crisis of the 80s, and the imposition of neoliberal adjustment policies of the Washington Consensus, starting with the US-backed military coup in Chile in 1973, the road to industrialization was to a great extent abandoned, and the traditional theory of comparative advantages was again used to argue the need to concentrate on what the continent did best, produce commodities. A new age of market fundamentalism was to dominate the continent for the next decades. In the 1990s, as part of the implementation of neoliberal adjustment policies and the creation of WTO and multiple bilateral and multilateral free trade agreements and investment agreements, most of the Latin American countries changed their mining legislation. Previous limitations to foreign direct investment in mining activities were removed. Different countries started to compete with each other in order to create the most attractive conditions for investment by transnational corporations in mining and energy. This meant, among other things, the privatization of state mining companies, further flexibility for capital markets, new regimes of investment protection that gave foreign investment the same right as national investors, flexibility of labor markets, and in several cases, not only low taxes, but guarantee that this would not increase for many, many years. A further push in the direction of increased concentration in production and export of commodities, not only in the mining sector, but in energy and agriculture, has been the extraordinary increase in both the demand and the price of commodities in the last decade. And this, in the case of Latin America, can be seen basically as an impact of the very rapid growth of especially China. For Latin America, this has meant a drastic increase in extractive pressures, as both the demand and the price of commodities has continued to grow. Latin American exports to China are proportionately more commodity-based than is the case with its traditional trading partners, that is, the United States and the European Union. Almost 90% of the total Latin American exports, Latin American and Caribbean exports to China, are unprocessed natural resources or natural resource-based manufactured goods. The fact that in some of these countries, like it's the case of Venezuela and Ecuador, China has become the main source of external financing, gives the Chinese government much of an upper hand in their negotiations in the quest for the guarantee of long-term access to mineral, energy, and agricultural resources. Chinese credits to Latin American countries, unlike the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, impose no political conditions. What is required is access to resources, or that the credit is paid back in resources. In the case of Ecuador and Venezuela, paid back in oil. That is, loans backed by commodities. And China has become, for all of Latin America, the main source of foreign loans. The other most important actor in the mining sector in Latin America in the last decade are Canadian mining corporations that over the last years have spread their activities throughout the country. The Toronto Stock Exchange has become the most important venue for mining corporations in all the world. The struggles and the perspectives for alternatives to extractivism in Latin America. Over the last decade and a half, South America was the region in the world where alternatives to developmentalism and extractivism seemed possible. Very strong and dynamic social movements defeated right-wing military dictatorships, toppled neoliberal governments, and were able to defeat the most important imperial project for the continent, the Free Trade Treaty of the Americas, or FTAA. This was possible thanks to an extreme-wide conversion of movements and organizations in the confrontation with all neoliberal expressions: free trade, agribusiness, destruction of the rights, destruction of the public, the commodification and financialization of nature, attacks on cultural plurality, women's rights, etc., etc. Leftist and progressive governments came into power on the back of these movements and organizations. As an expression of the demographic significance and the extraordinary mobilization of indigenous people in Ecuador and Bolivia, the new constitutions of these countries are based on the concepts of the good life, summa camaña, summa causai. The idea of summa camaña, or buen vivir, implies not only solidarity amongst humans, but equally living in harmony with and in nature. In the words of Alberto Acosta, who presided the Constitutional Assembly in Ecuador for most of its debates, living well, or buen vivir, is born out of the collective life expectancy experience of the indigenous people and nationalities. It seeks a harmonious relation between humans and the rest of nature. However, after a few years of progressive and leftist governments in Latin America, nothing much has changed in terms of putting a stop to commodification and the financiation of nature. All across the continent, no matter what type of government, leftist, revolutionary, progressive, or neoliberal, the indiscriminate assault on Mother Nature has accelerated. As Maristela Swampa, a colleague from Argentina, has named, the continent now has a new consensus to replace the Washington consensus. This is the consensus of commodities. In country after country, the proportion of primary goods in the composition of primary exports has increased over the last decade, precisely the decade in which this left turn has occurred in Latin America. No? Okay. This is just a summary comparing the proportion, the value of primary goods in the total value of exports for different Latin American countries, for Mercosur, and for the total of Latin America. And with the exception of Argentina, that has had an industrial policy over the last decades, or over the last decade in the governments of the Kirchners, there has been a shift in all the continent towards an increased dependency on primary exports. For the whole of the continent, from 40% to 60% in less than 10 years. If we look at the statistics, we find that there's no difference between the countries with neoliberal governments like Colombia, Peru, Chile, left-center or social democratic governments like Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, and so-called leftist or revolutionary governments like Ecuador, Bolivia, and Venezuela. We now have what has been called progressive extractivism in Latin America. To be fair, one has to acknowledge the fact that the so-called progressive leftist governments are subject to very contradictory pressures and demands from different sectors of the population. While the indigenous and peasant communities demand the defense of their territories, and in the case of Ecuador and Bolivia, demand that the content of the constitutions be respected, on the other hand, popular urban sectors are most likely to have demands that require an increase in government expenditure, in direct money transferences, food and service subsidies, and other forms of public social expenditure in education, health, and social security. The easiest and most immediate source of government revenue is the expansion of extractive activities. It is also the case that short-term demand has increased public expenditure related to the electoral cycles that have become more important in determining actual policies than the far more challenging goal of transforming societies in the direction of the good life and in the search for alternatives to the economic models that are destroying the planet. The explicit option in favor of developmentalism and extractivism is best highlighted by a recent declaration by the presidents of ALBA, that is, the Association of the countries that have leftist governments in Latin America today. That's Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and some some Caribbean countries. The declaration states, "We express the right and the need of our countries to take advantage." This is a reply to the critics of extractivism in these countries and the response to the social mobilizations and struggles against extractivism that's occurring across the continent. We express the right and the need of our countries to take advantage in a responsible and sustainable way of renewable natural resources, which have the potential to be used as an important source to finance economic development, justice, and ultimately the welfare of the people, making it clear that the main social imperative of our time, of our region, is to combat poverty and misery. In this regard, we reject the extremist positions of certain groups that, under the banner of anti-extractivism, consistently oppose the exploitation of natural resources, demanding that this only be done on the basis of the consent of the people and communities living near the sources of wealth. In practice, this would be impossible to take. This would make impossible to take the alternative that would ultimately risk the social and economic successes that have been achieved. What is most alarming about this explicit declaration is the rejection of indigenous peoples' rights to previous consultation in relation to activities that might affect their territories, as are enshrined in international law, in the organization of the International Labour Organization Convention 169, and in most of the countries' constitutions. This is, of course, not to deny the extraordinary important changes that have happened in the continent over the last decade and a half. But since it's not the purpose of my talk today, I won't have time to deal with these issues, even in the very schematic way that I planned originally. Resistance. Due to the continuation and deepening of developmentalism and extractive model common to all South American, resistance to extractivism in all its forms and the defense of territories by peasants, indigenous people and communities, as well by small rural towns, has become perhaps the main focus of popular struggles in the continent. There are many reasons for the direction of extractivism. Viewed from a historical perspective, the ways of insertion of Latin America economies in the world economy, the process of reprimarization is a return to the colonial mode of participation in the international division of labor and nature. The governments argue that this is just the first stage of the development process, necessary both to respond to social demands and to accumulate the resources required for a productive, non-extractive economy. However, historical experience has shown that extractive activities create relatively few jobs, particularly very few high-quality jobs. Working conditions in mining activities tend to be by far the worst. Mining communities are often characterized by poor housing, limited or non-existent public services, violence, and prostitution. When the exploitation of the commodity is no longer profitable, sometimes huge communities are simply left behind with no alternative source of income. Commodities tend to have a huge fluctuations in price in the international markets, leading to cycles of expansion and bust for countries that are highly dependent on one particular commodity. A concentration on high-price commodities usually leads to the so-called Dutch disease. As a result of the abundance of foreign currency resulting from the export of commodities the national currency becomes overvalued. It becomes cheaper to import things than to produce them locally. Locally produced goods are not competitive in the international market. Production of industrial and agricultural goods are thus negatively impacted. Venezuela, a classic example of the Dutch disease, that had a Dutch disease much before the Dutch discovered gas in the Northern Sea, has had the so-called resource course for over a century. In spite of fertile agricultural land and a limited population in relation to the size of the country, a very high proportion of the food consumed in the country needs to be imported. And as you can see here, more than 95% of the total value of exports is one product, oil. This is also closely associated with a political and cultural dimension, which is the model of the rentier state. Since the central government receives a large proportion of the national income, political institutions and parties tend to be organized around the struggle for the distribution of these resources. The result tends to be a highly centralized, not particularly democratic state, and a very weak dependent society. Once established, this political culture and institutions tend to expand and be self-reproducing. This creates great obstacles for the autonomous local grassroots organizations, as well as for the recognition of the pluricultural character of most of these societies. I could go on and on about the Venezuelan experience in this respect. These extractive policies have led to a reversal of the productive and industrialization achievements of the period of import substitution. This has led to what Pierre Salama has called premature deindustrialization. Even in the case of Brazil, one of the BRICS and one of the most dynamic emerging countries, the proportion of industrial goods in the economy and the proportion of industrial goods, especially high technology industrial goods, has been progressively decreasing as a consequence of a new emphasis on the export of commodities. The proportion of primary exports in the case of Brazil to China increased from 20% in 1995 to 80% in 2008. These are, however, not the main reasons why extractivism has become such a political charged issue in Latin America in recent years. Social and political opposition to extractivism has had to do basically with the destructive environmental and social impacts of these activities, especially for peasant and indigenous people and communities. Their expulsion from ancestral territories, the destruction of vital headwaters, contamination or diversion of water, massive deforestation, contamination of land, removal of vegetation and topsoil, large-scale use of pesticides and other highly contaminating agrochemicals, substitution of food production oriented for self-consumption and local markets for agrofuels and other export-oriented commodities. Large-scale mining projects require massive amounts of electricity, often leading to the construction of huge hydroelectric dams that cause environmental damage and often displace tens of thousands of people. This is the case of the biggest dam under construction in Latin America today, the Belo Monte Dam in Brazil. Although probably not the main driver of these struggles, the concern about the local and global climate impacts of large-scale extractive projects like open pit mining, extensive agricultural monoculture, or fossil extraction has become an increasingly important concern. This has led in all of Latin America to very diverse forms of struggles. There is a large variety of struggles, such as popular assemblies, the occupation of disputed territories, roadblocks, local and regional referenda, local and regional strikes, as well as legislative proposals drawn up through popular initiatives to prohibit large-scale mining. In some cases, like in Peru and Argentina, local or regional authorities have drawn up in their struggle against these mining projects, confrontations not only with the corporations, but also with the federal governments by establishing local or regional bylaws that prohibit this type of activities. These mostly eco-territorial struggles or social environmental struggles are rooted in local communities and can in no way be isolated as if they were simply ecological or environmental struggles. For indigenous people across the continent, resistance to extractivism in their territories, as history has shown over and over, is a question of cultural and even physical survival. The logic of what has been characterized by David Harvey as accumulation by dispossession has been rapidly expanding. I would like to now very briefly show you, very briefly, that way. Oh, this way, okay. Just highlight some of the most important sort of paradigmatic struggles in, this is a map of the sort of main concentrations of indigenous people struggles against extractivism in all of South America, Latin America. This is a case of the impact of Texaco Chevron oil exploitation in the Ecuadorian Amazon, and this is what was left behind. This led to the Yasuni project, of which we'll hear more, which is one of the best organized and more thought out and most active movements that at a local level and an international level, that with a proposal to leave the oil in the soil in a nearby area in the Yasuni National Park and a place where indigenous people live. And unfortunately, as Yvonne will tell us in her presentation, the government of Ecuador has just announced that it will go ahead with the exploitation of oil in the Yasuni. This is a Yasuni National Park. That's a Yasuni campaign. The most paradigmatic struggle in Bolivia has been the struggle against the construction of a road through the Isoboro Secure National Park, indigenous territory. The construction of a road through the park means that there will be access for loggers, for planters of soya, for coca, etc. And experience has shown that there is a very direct, even short-term impact of road construction through indigenous territories. And the people of the Yasuni have been struggling against this road, which is backed by the Brazilian government through its financing and through its construction corporations. This is part of the mobilizations. People walked from the Amazon to La Paz, from almost sea level to almost 4,000 meters after 2 months of walk. This is when they arrive at La Paz. The Pascua Lama mining project is a mining project for the exploitation of basically gold and silver up in the Andes between Chile and Ecuador, Chile and Bolivia, and what Barrick Gold wanted to do was to displace the glaciers, which are the source of water for millions of people, literally, in order to be able to exploit these resources. This is where the mine is. Between Argentina and Ecuador, this is about 5,000 meters high. That's what the landscape is like. And this is one of the victories in the struggles in Latin America when the Argentine parliament finally approved the law to prohibit the destruction of the glaciers. This is a conga mining project in Peru, which is a huge project that implied basically the destruction of the water sources of the communities and 5 lagoons, which are the headwaters and water sources for many, many communities all around. And this has been quite paradigmatic in Peruvian struggles and in all of Latin America in the struggles against open pit mining. This is the Belomonte Dam, which is planned to be the 3rd largest dam in the world. This is very flat territory, so it occupies enormous territory and has very destructive impact on the people who live there, on fishing, on agriculture. That's a dam. This is resistance to coal mining in Venezuela and struggles against fracking in Vaca Muerta, in which the same company that was expelled from Ecuador and responsible for the destruction of the Ecuadorian Amazon has been authorized now by the Argentinian government to exploit gas through fracking methods in Argentina. So, just to end, the struggle goes on. Perhaps the 2 most important victories are the one I mentioned about the glaciers in Argentina and the fact that in Costa Rica, large-scale mining has been prohibited in the whole of the territory. I mean, the country as a whole has prohibited large-scale mining, and this is a product of a very long struggle with the convergence of organizations on the left and social movements. So, victories are possible. Thank you.